Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning into today's virtual program. I'm Miranda at Rome Historical Society, and today we're joined with Jim Coulthart, the administrator at Clinton Historical Society. So hello, Jim. How are you doing today?
Good, Miranda. Good to be here. Thank you.
Good. So this video is part of our free monthly programming. On the third Wednesday of every month, we upload a video like this to our Facebook, and we're going to continue to do programming virtually throughout 2021. So we encourage you to like this video, share this video, and leave us comments to give us feedback because we miss all of you and we'd really like to hear from you. So the most up-to-date information about our reopening and what we're doing at the Society will be on our website, romehistoricalsociety.org, or on our Facebook page, facebook.com/romehistorical. So without further ado, we have Jim here, and so you're a military aviation enthusiast, and you've done a lot of research on the 1950s international arms business.
Correct, and I have to say right at the beginning here, and I'm not sure how much you can see, but you must be correctly attired to give this kind of talk. So
you fit the bill. That's good. It looks good.
Thank you. And I want to thank all those people on behalf of my wife who has listened to this and is not as much of an enthusiast of aircraft as I am. This gives me a chance to geek out on the stuff I'm interested in. So thank you for your patience and involvement. So why don't we start, Miranda?
Yeah, I'll start. I'll share your presentation, and then you can tell us all about it.
Right.
All right. All right.
Here's the title piece for it. And actually, one of these things that when you're bitten by any bug, you find more things. So this program was originally put together in 2019, and it was a culmination of over a year's worth of work at that point. But since then, I've added some new things to it. So a little different, a little bit more detail. So Miranda, next, please. This has to do largely with the Royal Canadian Air Force coming in possession of, at the end of World War II, 150 Mustangs. And right there are the different squadrons that were involved in using the P-51s. And I want you to note that of particular note was the 403 City of Calgary squadron and the 416th Lynx Squadron, because that will come into play a bit later. Next. All right, here's a couple of depictions of the aircraft done up, and obviously it's a U.S. aircraft that was acquired and used by our allies during the war, and here it is in the livery of the Royal Canadian Air Force. Next. So where I get involved in this, where it begins with me, is as a kid. I live in Oneida, and those of you who may or may not be familiar with Oneida, Canastota area, Route 5, when you go from Oneida to Canastota, just west of Canastota is where the Canastota Airport used to be located. 1928, it was notable that Lindbergh actually came there and touched down, but I'm not that old. My interest goes back to when I was a kid in the 60s. You could look from Route 5 north, and this picture right here depicts one of the P-51s that was on the field at the time. It's to the right of the hangar. And that's what piqued my curiosity, because I've always had an interest in aircraft to the point where, fanciful, wanted to be a fighter pilot kind of thing. So, but I always wondered what the story was behind that. And now things are a little bit more into focus. Upon retirement, this was one of the first projects I wanted to undertake and get some answers to. Next. All right, so Fast forward here to 1986. My father, who I inherited the bug from, was thumbing through a directory of warbirds, and he noticed, and that's both the book on the left as well as his notes on the right there were no fewer than 45 P-51s that had the serial numbers that at one point in their lives came through Canastota. And you have to ask yourself the question, Canastota? I mean, I could see Syracuse, but Canastota, this very nondescript municipal airport. And a lot of these were like you have a registration on a car that gives you the provenance of where it came from, who had it before you. You look at these, and this tells you something. There were 45, like I said, plus serial numbers that were tied to a Fred Ritz or a James DeFuria, okay, working under the name or in the name of the International Airways at Canastota. So next, please. All right, so first we're going to talk about the birth of the P-51. It was originally a contract by the RAF in Britain at the start of the war because, unfortunately, fortunately or unfortunately, depending upon which way you look at it, innovation happens when there's war, i.e. arms race. The word was put out to North American to submit a design for something that could supersede or replace over time the Hurricanes and Spitfires. Edgar Shumed was the engineer in charge of coming up with this plan, and from the signed contract to the prototype, 102 days. So that was quite an expedition that happened there in a short period of time. The British initially passed on this because it had an Allison engine as part of its design that did not perform well at higher altitudes. Okay, so that kind of got a little tabled, shall we say. Next. All right, so, but World War II is in place, and the P-51, just a brief thing here, because as I said, you start reading stuff and then you find out other stuff and you kind of track down the materials. This is perhaps one of the most iconic World War II photographs, and it's of the Badisham 4 from the 375th Fighter Squadron. I'm actually reading the biography of Urban Ben Drew, who was depicted in plane number 2 there. It's the one with the S after the national insignia, so it's a second from the top. And the typical fighter pilot stories, but interestingly enough, none of the planes, in this photograph made it to the end of the war. Okay, some of the pilots did. In fact, Ben Drew obviously made it but they all met with a disaster at one time or another. And so much like the Iwo Jima flag raising, where many of the guys who were involved in the flag raising in Iwo Jima were killed in battle a short time later. So this is the plane. Next, please. So here's the hero, the war hero, very advanced technology. Now, what happened the time it was considered unworthy by the RAF to the time it became arguably the plane that saved the strategic bombing campaign over Europe? Well, the engine was swapped out. What was the Allison engine became replaced by the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. The plane themselves and I know this is recorded, so you can go back and look at this. The planes themselves were, there were 15,000 of them built at a cost of $51,000. Now, if you look down towards the bottom under range there, that's the key. They could escort the bombers over enemy territory and back with that range that other planes had been unable to do. And what that allowed the fighters to do was to drive off the German fighters. So that's what their secret was to success. Next.
So I have a question for you, Jim. The range is that, if you fill up the gas tank, that's how far the plane can fly before it has to land again?
Correct. And there were several tanks distributed around the airframe because you cannot have just, you have to drain them in the proper order, otherwise it makes the plane a bear to fly. So,
okay.
But that was the range, yes. Now, so let's get to the fact that we're now fast forwarding. The P-51s were declared obsolete by the Canadians in the mid-1950s, and these are some P-51s parked out on the ramp in Western Canada. So they were, they were basically declared surplus. All right, but there were a lot of them. They had a great performance background, and frankly, this fighter was sought after because this was only within 10 years of the end of World War II. So the concept was not outdated yet, even though we had moved, some of the countries had moved on to jets. So next, please. Obviously, entrepreneurism around the world. How do you make swords into plowshares? On the left is an aircraft carrier that has on its deck P-51s. And these things were, just imagine at the end of the war, hundreds of thousands of planes that were no longer needed for their initial purposes. Some of them brought back servicemen from overseas. Some of them were mothballed for later use. Thousands of plane frames, airframes were deposited around the country. And I apologize that this is kind of small print, but I put in this yesterday with Bill Powell's story of a Stanley Purdy from in Walnut Ridge area. He went and bought a B-17, the 4-engine bomber, for $300. Okay, because again, at this point there was no need for these for the fighting planes. 5,200 planes were parked at Walnut Ridge, okay? Including, for $500, you could buy a factory fresh B-29. Never been flown or rarely been flown, probably right from the assembly line to storage. And of course, the B-29 was the plane that dropped Nagasaki and Hiroshima bombs. And when you bought these planes, the government, the dispersal entity said you got to get them off the lot. Okay, the agreement was if you bought it, it was a bargain basement deal for the plane, but you had to get it off the lot. Now, some of these had been sitting there for a while. This is just after the war, 46, 47. Bill, let's see here, the plane that Stanley Purdy got, he had to get it from from Park Ridge to Louisville. And what happened was, on as many times this happened was, there were 3 engines operating. So here here is Mr. Pretty with a buddy of his flying a plane out under less than ideal conditions. Eventually, he brought it back to Louisville. Over time, he gave it to a Boy Scout Air Scout group in the Chicago area. So, but that gives you an idea of how, bargain basement prices, let's get rid of it all. Next, please. Paul Mantz has a very storied life biography that I would recommend people read. He was big in the airplanes for movie stunt business and an entrepreneur. And I just thought it would be interesting for you all to see that in the case of Paul Mantz, he was able to purchase, now just think about this, 75 B-17s, 228 four-engine bomber B-24s, 10 B-25s, that was the Doolittle Raider, another 22 B-26 known as the Widowmaker, 8 Mustangs, several Cobras, P-40s, P-47s. All of that cost the taxpayers in the day $117 million, okay, at the price. He purchased them all for $55,000 at the time. The thought was he was using stunt planes using the planes to do stunts for movies. And like 12 O'Clock High, the iconic World War II movie, he flew in a B-17, crash landed it, wheels up, and because he could, because they were relatively cheap. So that gives you an idea. The thought was, by the way, the rationale was the fuel that was left over in the tanks of these planes could be sold, and he would recoup the value of his purchase right out of the gate. So next, please. So after World War II, a lot of planes were again floating around, but what was going on at the time? Among other things was the establishment of the State of Israel, and they needed weapons to fend off the countries that did not want to see a state or an Israeli state put in. So up in the upper left, you got some aging B-17s that made their way probably through black market means to Israel to fight, because you have the Star of David on the fuselage there. And these are the older B-17s. They did not have the chin guns. Chin guns is in the front of the plane, 250 caliber machine guns usually mounted to fight off the German head-on attacks. You also had, obviously, a Mustang, and then lower left is a Spitfire. In the center is a post-war version of the ME-109, and I'm going to come back to that in a little bit to give you an idea of the arms entrepreneurial spirit that was probably everywhere and continues to be. But on the right, I actually watched this movie. It's a story, it's called Above and Beyond, and it's the story of Israeli pilots who were, many of them, they were, first of all, they believed in the establishment of Israel, but they also got paid to do this. Many of them were ex-American Air Force, British, French. A fascinating movie to watch. So next, let's see here. So we're looking back, and this is 1958. This is the Crown Assets Disposal Report. And for those of you who may be familiar with, right after when Griffiths was closed, there was an entity that was put on the base to get rid of all the surplus equipment. This is actually a screenshot. So what I wanted to show you all was that if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see the, and it's, looks like number 2 from the top, the 49,000 figure. And underneath that, there are several Mustang airframes and a lot of parts that were purchased by, in this case, James DeFuria, again, out of DeWitt, near Syracuse. And they were, brought for purchase to be used, to be sold to other lesser military markets. And the thing, and again, there were several of these to the tune of between 70 and 80 planes, if you tracked them all down. What I also found interesting was the ships and ship components. He also purchased a Canadian Navy vessel, the Le Havre, and I have no idea what the thought was behind that. Now, later on, I found out that one of the plans that Ritz and DeFuria had was to do a one-stop shopping to his arms purchasers. And that would be, if you bought the plane, you got the pilot, and you even got a vessel. This was just speculation on my part, but there was mention of the fact that that they could become seaborne. So at the very least, it was a storage type thing. Interesting speculation. That's where we are. Go ahead, Miranda. Next one. So who are the customers? A lot of them were South American. This is the post-war market. A lot of things going on in South America by way of governmental takeovers, juntas, coups, whatever you want to call them. And so these were some of the planes that would, for the time, were relatively modern technology. They weren't the jets, but they were modern technology. So this just gives you a flavor of them. Next. And I'm not going to go through all of these really in detail, so don't worry. But, this is, for instance, Costa Rica. These are ex-Texas Air National Guard planes. They were in storage. A lot of them were sold off and then wound up in South American markets in that case. Next. And I think this was one of the intended markets for Mr. Ritz and Mr. DeFuria, was to take these planes down to Cuba. Okay. But unfortunately, the planes were stopped from being taken. Well, they made their way to the United States, and we'll hear about that in a second. But the overall purpose of using the planes for a revolutionary government, when as a country, as a national policy, we back Batista. So the P-51s, I believe some of them were bound for Cuba. Next, please. The gentleman on the far left is Major Pedro Lanz, and he was Fidel Castro's choice to head the Cuban Air Force, and he wanted the F-86, the Sabre, which was state-of-the-art technology, but because he insisted upon that instead of getting, in his opinion, in hand P-51s, the whole project got scuttled between the Canadian government. Next. Sorry, I got ahead of myself here. Interestingly enough, the Dominican Republic was another entity that used, and some of these planes wound up being purchased by a company called Cavalier, that was a firm down south that refurbished the P-51 and made it a more modern fighter with lighter components and things like that. Next. Let's see here. The interesting thing about this, again, this is Guatemalan Air Force, is that some of these planes were, when they were done, when the Guatemalan, Air Force was done with them, they were purchased eventually by Wilson Connie Edwards. Next, please. And Connie Edwards, real colorful character. He was a fighter pilot and was a member of what was then called the Confederate Air Force, which was a loose confederation of former fighter pilots and other air aficionados who, and the whole idea behind the Confederate Air Force was the use of and purchase, excuse me, sorry about that, get a little talky here. And the Confederate Air was named the Confederate Air Force in part because everybody was a colonel. So you not only had your own plane, but you were a colonel. You had the honorary title of colonel. Since recent years, the title of the group has changed to Commemorative Air Force in light of recent thoughts and approaches to things. Next. The thing about Connie is that in the whole warbird market is very fluid. He participated as a pilot in the Battle of Britain movie, 1969, and he didn't get paid what he felt was the right amount for his work that he did. So in exchange, he took a number of planes, including 6 Messerschmitt Me-109s that were decommissioned by the Spanish Air Force and eventually wound up in the movie. And he kept them in a barn in Midland, Texas. Connie died maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and those 6 Messerschmitts, or they were called Buchens, they were sold at auction for $6 million, a lot of them. One of the planes was a dual occupant plane in which Adolf Galland, the famous German ace, German Luftwaffe ace, and I think it was Johnny Johnson, both were in an Me-109 for the movie. They were both consultants on the Battle of Britain. But if you can imagine 2 former foes in the same plane flying and as technical advisors to the movie. Okay, we can go next here, Miranda. Again, the Bolivian Air Force planes were, some of them, 9 of them were acquired by Cavalier. And, pardon me, and they wound up in the States and wound up refurbished. Next. Again, people can scroll, take as much time as they want to on this. Next. Interesting here is that the Mustangs were, some of them were shot down by Corsairs, and the last of them were sold off in '74, the year I graduated from high school, which was many moons ago. Next, please. But closer to home, this is a nice painting of the Hancock Field in Syracuse. And this is after the war. Initially, Hancock was a staging location for bombers and fighters and transport planes going to Europe. And as a result, they had the 138th Fighter Squadron, which is depicted here. They called that home for a while. And again, this is an Air National Guard. I just like this photograph, so that's why you got it. Next. So let's get back to the story here. If you remember when we last left our little odyssey about the Canadian planes, Prime Minister John Diefenbacher in 1958 said, and this is in the parliamentary records of Canada, every step will be taken to ensure that the Canadian Mustang plane sold to a U.S. firm, International Airways, located in Canastota, will not go to undesirable locations. So now you have Mr. DeFuria and Mr. Ritz with, 78 Mustangs and a few Seafires. What do you do with them? So that things got a little complicated there for a while. And I showed you the picture. The previous slide was about the Hancock Field. This is Canastota back in the day. It is now largely abandoned, and there's a little bit of tarmac at the end of at the runway, but it's largely most of the buildings are gone, and it's now an industrial park. Next. So, and these are some. This is a picture that I happened to see in Syracuse when I went to the new Syracuse Regional Museum, Transportation Museum, which is on site at the airport. So I would suggest it's free to go. You just have to pay for parking. But these are some of those 138th Fighter Squadron P-51s parked on the edge of the ramp. Next. And so this is back to Canada a little bit here. So these planes, and this is again from transcripts. What about these planes? The Canadians are irate at the fact that these planes are being sold for pennies, and being purchased by what, by all outward appearances, appear to be entrepreneurs traveling and trading in warplanes. It is specifically said that the planes were sold for hundreds of dollars, and they could get anywhere from $4,000 to $5,000 to $6,000 for them. So, next, quite a bit of outrage there. Seafire, that's what a Seafire looks like on the left, and then a P-47, which is another type of plane that was used at Hancock, is on the right. And the logo there is the squadron insignia of the 138th. Next. So here are, and this was hard to find, any pictures of the planes when they were out at Syracuse. So these were a couple of pictures that were parked on the edge. As you remember, the plan and the plan was to take the planes from a storage location in eastern central Canada and fly them down to central New York, and then have work done on them, and then refurbish them, and then send them to whatever market. So these were just some, and I was happy when I saw these pictures in a book I was researching. So it's just, it is fascinating to see it in it, what actually happened. Next, please. The Canastota Airport, back in '43, was designated a Civil Air Patrol field. And by the end of the war, because a lot of work was done on some frontline P-51s, the field was upgraded and extended, okay, so that it could take because the P-51 is a hot rod, and if you don't know what you're doing, I had conversations with a guy who was a kid at the time, and he actually, they didn't care what happened to the plane. The owners of the airfield didn't care what happened to the planes at this point, and by the time everything with Ritz and DeFuria had gone south, he got in the plane. He was a pilot. He had gotten his license, and he started the plane up, and long story short, he wound up in a corn lot because he couldn't control it. All right, next. So a little bit about what I was able to find about Ritz and DeFuria, which wasn't a lot. Okay, they did a good job of covering their tracks. Jim DeFuria, a relatively decently known Syracuse businessman who made a bunch of money during the war in some machinery shops, some high tolerance engineering and machinery work. He said his answer to when somebody said, "Why did you do this?" He said, "I just got a bug to buy Mustangs." Now, look, come on. You know, that I think the between the lines there was a buck to be made. Fred J. Ritz, who I feel I'm pretty certain was from the Rochester area, because what I was able to find out about him was largely through the Rochester newspapers. He was in the surplus planes and parts business at the time. In fact, he was in the process of, when he was working, initially he was working for Consolidated Aircraft Supply, but then he went to work for Page Airways, and he was in the process, one of his ventures was to buy 700 jet engines from our scrapped B-36 air fleet. Okay, and the idea was to sell the engines, just the jet engines, to Yugoslavia, and then market some to Britain and France. Next. This is the B-36, and right on the edge of the wingtip on either side of the B-36 are these General Electric J47 engines. And those of you who may be Jimmy Stewart fans, Strategic Air Command, a lot of the aerial scenes are quite nicely done with music. This is the plane. Now, what is unique about this engine was this is the same type of engine similar to what was being used on the early B-52s and B-47s. So that people have an understanding. They had value, in other words. Next. The idea of refurbishing the airframes, the P-51 airframes, was not exclusive to, and selling them were not exclusive to Central New York. This is Dave Lindsay, who was a publisher, the Herald Tribune, and former founder and president of an airlines, and also, the father of the Cavalier P-51. Again, a lot of these guys at the end of the war, a lot of these fighter pilots, went into civilian life, but they continue to have a love of aircraft. Next. So how do you get the planes down from depot in Canada? You hire somebody like Len Garrison, okay? Len was an Royal Canadian Air Force commander who was a little too late for the World War II, but did have experience flying planes, the P-51, and he was the one that was tapped to get the planes from Canastota, from Canada to Canastota and Syracuse. He's written an autobiography, and he's your typical fighter pilot type. Many of the planes that were being ferried, because remember, these had been decommissioned several years before Ritz and DeFuria wanted to do something with them, had been sitting around. So, the radios didn't work. Not all of the hydraulics worked. Not all the electrical worked. So, and of course, then you had on top of it, if you came into Canastota, you were dealing with a very, I guess, not primitive, but not exactly an advanced runway. So you'll notice at the bottom there, that's one of the planes that Len Garrison was ferrying. And if you go on YouTube and you put in Len Garrison crash landing Canastota, there's a video of that. So it's just kind of cool. Next, please.
So was he the only one flying those planes down from Canada?
You should say that. Just funny. But here's, before we get to another character, this is his autobiography, and the gentleman, Lynn, is, last I checked, was still alive. He's got to be in his early 80s. And so this is what he looked like. And he was supposed to be writing a follow-up to this book. And it was supposed to be featured the Canastota escapades. But I haven't seen anything yet. And, and again, he may be gone off to that great airplane in the sky. But I have to check and see. Every once in a while I dip in and see. Keep going, please. Next. Here is Milt Hardens. Okay, and funny you should say that. Milt and Lynn served together in 403 Squadron. And Milt was an attorney by trade after the war. But again, a fighter pilot, you get the bug and you just can't leave it alone. So here he is. He eventually became a judge, by the way, a justice up in Canada. And he went with Lynn to ferry some of these planes. And as I say there at the bottom, they're flying well at radios. Most of the time they navigated following the Canadian Pacific Railroad tracks eastward. So that's how they did it. They were able to do dead reckoning. So, and again, it's like so many things, like the Connie Edwards story, where he didn't get paid in plane, or he didn't get paid for his efforts. Milt and Lynn eventually had a falling out. And it was quite contentious, a friendship that went south when things broke down. Next, please. All right, Garrison, just a quick footnote here. He at the time of this, 1969, he owned that Corsair, which is on the left there. This is a depiction of an incident that happened during what's called the football war, or the soccer war, or the 100 Hours War, between El Salvador and Honduras. And it was called the Soccer War because it happened about the time of the playoffs. And it was the last known piston plane to piston plane action. So that's just kind of an interesting footnote there. Keep going. Next, please. So when things went wrong, things went wrong with Ritz and DeFuria in the U.S. as well as the Canadian government said, not so fast. This left them with several airplanes that they had no way to deal with. What do you do when the market has dried up? And again, I apologize on this, but I wanted you to see that there are some interesting points here. They had their relationship did not last too long, and then it got contentious. There are notes by particularly Mr. Ritz, legal actions on various undertakings. And wound up in the court and settled and things like that. But so you have planes that had to be defanged, if you will. The military hardware had to be taken out of them. Eventually, they got them back to the States, but they were largely paper tigers. Next, please. So what do you do with them? Well, you scrap them, some of them. And this will break some people's hearts. Here's some that were being cut up for scrap. Next. A lot of the planes, or some, not a lot of the planes, but some of the planes wound up on the black market and got sold to different war zones across the world. Some of them wound up in refurbished type of thing. When I was doing the research on the planes, some of the planes, their serial numbers disappeared or were mysteriously struck off. And so sometimes their lives were taken off the books, and you know what happened then. It was basically sold under the table type of thing. Next. Interesting local angle here, and this is how the planes got to be in Canastota. This plane here, and if you remember, I told you to pay attention to the Lynx picture in the beginning. This is from that squadron, and it's since become known as the Denman Mustang. Okay, it was from the Royal Canadian Air Force. It arrived in Canastota. Jim Cosgrove, who was working for the Syracuse Herald-Journal, I had lunch with him one day, and he told me the story of this, that Ray Denman had relayed to him that Denman was going through Canastota and literally saw men swinging axes and chopping up airplanes. And he said, oh my gosh, being a pilot, it broke his heart. So he said, is there any way I can get one? And after some haggling, he bought one of the airframes, this one, for $400. And that at the time, the people that were doing it, if it had been sold, could have gotten $4,000 for it. Denman had this plane towed up Route 81. He had a dealership in Brewerton, and apparently it was quite the attention getter, because among other things, the state police had to come and make sure that the crowd, the roads were unclogged. The plane was it sat in a lot for years. A lot of veterans and aficionados of aircraft like me stopped by to see it. And eventually the plane was purchased and registered and refurbished. And next, this is what she looks like today. Okay, so Geraldine. Okay, so keep going. Next, please. Some of them wound up in Canada. The vintage wings of Canada outside of Ottawa. I've actually sat in the cockpit of this plane, and it is one that they've restored to Canadian colors. So there's one that actually came home. Next. And if you're interested in how you get planes from South America or other countries back to the United States, this is an interesting story by Mr. Martin, who told the story of dealing with South American dictators and other people in the process of getting things back, to buying something and getting it back to the warbird market. Next. And again, here's what a Cavalier Enforcer looks like. It's the airframe for the P-51 served well past Vietnam, and so it turned out to be a durable design. Next. So here's the silver lining to this whole tortured story. So with some heroes and some villains, of the 50 some odd Mustangs that are listed in the military aircraft that my father and I referred to, at least 23 have a record of involving Mr. Ritz and DeFuria. So some of them wound up in other hands, many wound up in the hands of racers and collectors. So there you can see a racer that was heavily modified, and then a show plane on the right there. Next. So approximately 15,000 P-51s were made. You can see the breakdown there. And in terms of the airworthiness, and those that are on display and those that are in storage, and some that are unknown. And that's a picture that was taken at the Geneseo Air Show a couple of years ago. Next. So, and as far as this plane that bellied in Canastota, here it is today as Cripes a Mighty 4. So it's been captured, restored, or I should say not captured, but had a happy ending to it, taken over lovingly, and it's flying on the air show circuit. So I guess you could put at what started out as a self-serving business entity approach to things, wound up as something that we see at air shows whenever we go now. A lot of these have direct lineage to that. Next, please. So this is me in my lair, and if you have any questions or if you have some correcting information about this, I would be happy to hear it. This is one of many projects that I have an interest in. Currently working on some upstate New York stories of planes that have crashed and other aspects of notable interest in central New York, including the Hellcat, which was out at Griffiths. It was a B-26 that was refurbished. It was the first one to finish 50 missions, and it came back to Rome to be refurbished and sent back out into the field. So, and then there's Pistol Ball, which crashed down in Nelson, south of Oneida, a bomber, B-17 bomber. So that's the type of thing I've been doing. It keeps me off the street. So thank you, Miranda. Hopefully we didn't run over too badly.
No, I think we did pretty good, and it's really great to have someone like you, so enthusiastic and knowledgeable about a specific topic, share it with us. So it was really a pleasure to have you do this program with us.
Well, thank you, Miranda.